Alright, so as I mentioned at the end of the last video, in this part we're going to be covering routing in Express or using Express routers. And let's just go ahead and get started. So before I forget, we're going to want to include we're going to do another require here for we're going to call it body parser. We're going to require body-parser because we're going to need this, and I have a feeling I'm going to forget later. I'll explain that when we actually start using it, but you'll want to go ahead and include that. Should already be installed. If you're using Express version 4, at the time of making this video, the stable release is at beyond 4, so you should be fine. If you're on like Express 3, you would have to install that separately. But other than that, you should be good. Other thing I need to mention, we're going to be using an application called Postman. The website's getpostman.com. It's free, makes it super easy for testing APIs, and I believe it's on Mac, Windows, and Linux, so you should be good on whatever operating system you're using. You want to go ahead and download that because we're going to be using that in this video to test our backend. So we're going to create a test little blogging backend REST API just to show you a bit more about how the routes here work. So to start things off, let's make a new directory here and call routes. You can call this whatever you want and structure this however you want. This is just kind of common naming conventions here. So I'm going to create a folder called API inside of routes, and then inside of that API folder, we're going to create blog.js. And then we need to require Express into here first. And then after we require Express, we'll need to require Express router, which is, we'll just call router, and that's just going to be express.router. And then at the end of our file, we'll do module.exports, and then we're going to export that router. Okay, so instead of using app.get, when you're inside of a router, we don't have access to the app because it's outside of the scope of this file. So we use router instead. So we're going to be using router.get, router.post, etc. So to start things off, we'll do router.get, and then our path, which is just going to be the root of this router. And then the second argument will be our handler here, which is going to be request and response. And then for now, we'll just do a test response, respond.send. You made a GET request to the blog API. And then we'll copy this, but change it to a post. It's going to work the same way, except when someone makes a post request, it's going to use this route. When someone makes a GET request, it's going to use this route. And if you don't know much about REST APIs, basically when you're doing a GET, you're pulling data from the database. We're just going to be using static data. We're not actually going to set up a database for this right now, but GET will typically pull data from your REST API, and POST is going to create or update data. Some people, I believe, use POST for updating and PUT for creating new content, just to simplify things. And since we're not using a database, we're not really going to be creating new content. I just wanted to show how this works. So we're just going to be using GET and POST for now. And now that we have that set up, we want to go ahead and go back to our index.js and require this file. And I'm just going to call it blog router. And then if you're requiring a file that's in your project, that's not like a library you installed over npm or something, you're going to want to prefix it with // which indicates this current directory that we are in, that this file is in, which happens to be the root of our project directory. So we're going to say from the root of our project directory, routes, API, blog, and save that. And basically this export here is going to send this router variable here. It's going to basically return it, and it's going to set it to this blog router here. And then we need to use use function, which is for including middleware, which we'll have another part on later. But for now, you just need to know you use app.use for including your routers. And the first argument is going to be the path, so /API/blog. And the second argument will be the handler, which is this file that we just exported, that router we exported, which is we called blog router. And then we can, I believe, go ahead and test this. So let's start up our server. no errors, so that's good. And we'll host 3000. See hello world. And if you're unfamiliar with like GET and POST requests, if you go to an address in your browser, Chrome, Firefox, whatever, it doesn't matter. If you go to an address in your browser, it's going to be doing a GET request. So that's why we have the app.get for the /, which is the root of the website here. And then we created this new router that is at API/blog. And it says you made a GET request to the blog API. So now we're actually going to test this in Postman, the application I mentioned earlier, because we want to test some post requests, and that's going to make it really easy to do that from here. So we can put our URL back in and send that. By default, it's going to be doing GET requests. You made a GET request to the blog API. Here are a bunch of different methods. The 4 ones that we actually use in Express are get, post, put, and delete. For REST APIs, typically delete requests are to delete a resource from your database. Put would be creating a new object or creating new blog posts or whatever. Post, some people use for creating a new object or some entity, or updating it, creating or updating. Some people like to use post for update and put for create, or just post it'll create it if it doesn't exist, and if it does exist, then update it. And then get is for pulling data. So to test this out, we made a route for our .post at API blog, so we can change that to post and do send. It's going to say you made a post request to the blog API. So I know that's working. And just to, let's see, there's also, we're going to use this to, I guess we do need another window after all. We're going to use Chrome again. Let's see. JSON placeholder, I think it's just .com. Oh, no, JSON placeholder .typecode.com. This is useful for if you're just testing stuff out without using a database. So we'll go ahead and copy this and put it in our GET request here. Well, actually, I want to put that before this response.send. And so this is going to basically fetch this URL, which if we go here, it's just going to give us this. We actually don't want to do is I think it's called like posts. Yeah, here we go. So this is just going to generate some static data for us, so we don't have to set up a database. So if we go ahead and copy this and change the link here, app.post, then response JSON, and JSON console. So we're going to console log it. Don't need to do that, but we will. Actually, we'll keep that then there. And then with the JSON, instead of a console.log, we'll do a function here. Inside of that function, we'll put our response.send, and then JSON is going to be this response that we got from this here. This is using the fetch API, which is a part of vanilla JavaScript, I believe from ES6, so ECMAScript 2015. I may be wrong, don't quote me on that, but I believe that's something they introduced in ES6 was the fetch API. It's, I believe, supported by all major browsers now. In our case, we're using it in Node, which allows ES6, so it shouldn't matter either way. But I'm getting off track, so let's go ahead and do our GET request here. Fetch is not defined. I might need to actually require it. Fetch equals require fetch, maybe? You know what? You might need to install node fetch. I think there's an actual yeah, okay, sorry. We need to go ahead and do an npm install. So I guess it doesn't just work with Node. Npm install fetch, which is just going to bring that feature here into Node. And then, sorry, it's called node fetch, not fetch, for the one we're going to be installing. And now that we have that installed, let's change this to node fetch. And then the usage, let's see. Yeah, okay. Yeah, So we did that right. So fetch equals require node fetch, and then we're just going to call the fetch method here. So let's go ahead and start our server back up. And let's test this again. So if we make a GET request to API blog, there we go. Okay, so when we went here, it made a fetch, which is just basically, it's basically the same thing as like Ajax. It's like an asynchronous call to this address here, which when we went there, we saw it just returned a JSON file, which is just some sample placeholder data for some blog posts. Looks like something that you would get from a database for blog posts. And then it's promise based, so it's going to have a then response equals response.json. So we're actually taking that string response here that we got from the fetch and parsing it as a sorry about that. We're actually parsing that as a JSON file, as a JSON object. And then once that's complete, we are using that, we are sending that even further into a variable called JSON, and then we're just going to do a res.send JSON, which we could actually change this. There's something built in express res.json, which is going to automatically set our content type on here to, like on our headers. On the response, it's going to tell it like, hey, this is JSON that we're sending back to the client here. Which isn't going to make a huge difference just yet, but you do want to change that to res.json if you're sending JSON back. And then, okay, so we're not actually going to do the logic here for .post because we don't have a real database, so we don't have anything to actually write this data to. But hopefully this should just give you an idea of how this would work. If you're using something like Mongo or even SQL or MySQL, in your .post, you would have an object here that's like, just give you a quick little example. Yeah, we can actually, let's do this just to show you a bit more of how you would do this if you were using an actual database and writing data. So since we went ahead and required body parser, we can go ahead and in our request here for the post, we can do request.body, and for now we'll just comment that out and send this back just so we can see what's in here, just so I can show you. So by default, the way that we're doing this post request right now, we're not sending any form data, so it's just going to be blank. And actually, also another thing I forgot, we need to include the middleware for this. So we want to do that before we include this. So let's go ahead and do app.use again here, and we're gonna do body parser. What is it? URL encoded, and then we'll want to feed extended false, because this is actually, you can read the docs on this, but they don't support that officially anymore. I believe it's deprecated, but by default it's set to true, so we'll go ahead and set that to all false. And then so that's for parsing URL encoded forms. So parse application, what is it, xwww form URL encoded. And then we don't need to parse JSON. We're not going to be sending JSON to the REST server, so that should be it for now. And then once we go back here, do our send. Okay, so now we can see we're getting an empty object here. Before requests, because basically what this middleware is doing is creating this .body here for us, and whatever they send over, the client sends over. So in this case, it's our post. So like when you post, they're going to say, hey, this is the title, this is the body, this is the author ID or whatever. It's going to be sending all that, and we're going to access that through request.body. So we can go ahead and actually send some data here just to test this, and say title, this is a new blog post, and content, this is my blog post, body, This would be like the actual content of the blog post. Then author, depending on what database you're using, whatever, it could be an ID or it could be a name. We'll just say 1. So we'll imagine we had some kind of authentication system and this was user ID 1. So we send that, and now we can see in our response we're responding with this body object, which includes title, content, author, and it's automatically generated based off the data they sent over, and then the values here are all set for us. So you would do something like title equals request.body.title, and you would do the same thing for content and for author. And then response.send, we'll do .json. We'll just say, actually we'll just do a .send because this isn't, we're not actually updating anything, we're just pretending to show you how routes work. Content updated or added, and then we're going to do a console.log. Title, I think you can use these. I may be wrong. Let me see. Yeah, I believe we can use those in console.log. Title, content, author. Let me put a little colon. Alright, so now when we make our post request here, content added, and if we look in our log, we'll see title, this is a new blog post. Content, this is my blog post body, author 1. So you would use these variables here. You wouldn't just console.log them, you would actually add the data to your database here inside of your post table or whatever, and then send a response back. Typically your response would be JSON, and you would have like is error or whatever. It depends really on your use case, but you would let the user know that, hey, this succeeded or this failed, or you may return the record from the database back, and if no record returns, you can implies it failed. There's many different ways to do it. It's just kind of up to the developer on how they want to set that up. But that should give you an idea here of how you would do a, yeah, we don't want to do that, how you would make a post request to your API and update your database. And I think that about, you know what, there's another thing we can cover for routing that's used pretty often. Let's see. Okay, so we don't have a templating engine or anything like that set up yet, but we can show a quick little example of how this would work. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to create a new route outside of the API. This is actually going to be for our front end, and we're going to say index.js. So this is our main index route, and then we'll create another one called blog.js. And then we will copy over this blog router, even though it's for the API, we're just going to strip some stuff out. You can take out node fetch, take this out, just do a request.send. I'm going to say blog homepage, and then we can take this post out completely, and then that will do it for now for this file. And then our index router, we'll just say homepage, website homepage. And then we need to include these as well. So since we have a front and a back end now, I'm going to rename this blog router. You got to be sure to rename it down here in your app.use as well. We'll say blog API router. And then we will go ahead and include the rest. So we'll call the new one we just created blog router, and then the other one will be index router. Okay, so now we should have 3 requires up here: index router, blog router, and blog API router. Fix this to just go to So index router goes to routes index, blog router goes to routes blog, blog API router is for the backend, which is going to go to routes API blog. And then we got to include all of these as well with an app.use to make sure that they actually get used here. So the first one is just going to be slash, and that's going to be our index router. The next one is going to be slash blog, and that's going to be our blog router. And then the last one, API blog, that'll be our blog API router. Typically you'll just have one router here called API router, and then within that router you'll have a blog router, a user router, whatever backend kind of stuff you're going to be sending or receiving or creating or pulling, if that makes sense. Save this, make sure we get no errors. Okay, so now we can go ahead and test this out. Since we're working on the front end parts now, we can go over to localhost 3000. Should say, oh, we forgot to take out this route. So this one hit first. So this is in the order here. This path matched, so it used this response and it just kind of ignored the rest of the routes. So we'll want to take that out. And now refresh the page. Request.send is not a function. Response. Oh, you know what? No, sorry, I had it right the first time. It's the function should be res.send. I was using request.send, not response.send. So discard the last thing about switching. But yeah, request does need to be first and response needs to be second. I had that right. I just flipped it the wrong way. But yeah, use response.send or res.send, whatever you name this second argument here. Let's test that again. Okay, website homepage. And then if we were to go to slash blog, blog homepage. And then API, blog, it's going to do a GET request, which is going to return a JSON object of all of our quote-unquote blog posts from our quote-unquote database, just this placeholder object. But you should get the idea. So we're going to be working on this blog here. Typically we would use a templating engine or something for this. We're just going to show like a quick little demo just to get the idea, since we're mostly learning about routing here, not templating engines, which will probably actually segue us into our next part, which will be templating engines. So just to get this started and show you how this works before we get into all the templating type stuff, let's look at our blog.js. So this / is just going to be for blog here, and then we're going to create another route. We're going to say we're going to put a colon and what is it? We can call this whatever we want. We'll call this ID. I believe it's a colon. Hopefully I'm not wrong about that here. Colon ID and then response.send blog post. And basically this is, so when we go to /blog /anything, it's gonna put whatever we put here. So here, I'll just show you this because it's kind of weird to explain. So if we went to blog /1 or blog /2, and then if we were to console.log, I believe it's just going to be request.params. So if I were to print that out, let me go to the page, right? Console.log req.params. I got to spell that correctly. Clear this, refresh the page, and we should see an object here, ID2. So we could also just do request.params.id, refresh the page, 2. Okay. So we will set this to a variable. We're just going to call it post ID equals request.params.id. And then we can send this back and just say post ID instead of .logging it. Alright, so now the page is going to say 2. Obviously, we want more than just 2 here. So this is where we would query our backend API. And so if we look at our API route here, .get, we would create another .get, and we would say the same. We would do the same thing here, ID, and then let me just double check. If I go to this link here, I believe you can do 1, yeah, okay, and 2, and it gives us the placeholders. So okay, so we're gonna do ID, and then we're gonna do posts, and then we're gonna append that with or we can create a variable first, doesn't really matter. Post ID equals, and this is in our API route here, so if we do a GET request to /API/blog/ some number here, or some string, post ID will be request.params.id. So these just need to match, because it's just going to label it whatever you labeled it here. You can call it test. Test there, doesn't matter. Obviously, not the E at the end. So now we can just say post ID. And looking at that, now if we were to go into Postman to test this, API blog, we can clear this form data out because we're doing going to do a GET send. This is going to give us all of them. And then if we were to go 1, it's going to give us this one that matches on ID 1, or 2. It's going to give us the second post ID 3, and so on. So this is just kind of emulating what we would do if we were actually pulling that data from a real database. So now that we have that set up, we'll actually want to use fetch for now. Some people use Axios, but just to make things simple, I'm going to use fetch just because that's vanilla. Like, that's just JavaScript ES6. So on our front end here, so when they go to the page now, blog 2, okay, we're getting the post ID and setting it, the post ID here, and setting it to a variable called post ID, and then we're going to do a fetch to our own server here, /API/blogs/blog singular, called it blog, and then we're going to append that with post ID, and then we're going to do a .then, and I believe it's just response equals JSON response. Can make it a little cleaner here, and then do a function. Actually, I wanna, let's do it this way, because we actually need to pass that JSON through. And then here's our function. We're gonna do response.json instead of response.send here. That looks correct. No errors when we save. All right, so now if we go to blog homepage, blog 1. You might need to actually, only absolute URLs are supported. Okay, so you're gonna have to put the whole path here. Localhost 3000/API/blog. I've never actually tested it this way, so hopefully this actually works. Yes, okay, that worked. All right, so /blog/1 is gonna return this object, blog/2. So this is like our front end, and then this is really just calling our back end. But it's nice to have them separated, so you can extend your website and actually just have this REST API on the back. Obviously, in a real world scenario, you'd want some kind of authentication. You just don't want people to be able to pull any data from your database. But in this case, we're just using some placeholder data. Doesn't really matter. We don't need to authenticate, although we will cover that in a future video. For this one, we're just focusing on routing. So I think, is there anything else I can think of to cover for routing? Another thing to check out, I'm not going to cover every single little instance of routing in this video. I'm just trying to show you how it works. If you were to just go to the Express docs, there's some good docs here. expressjs.com, getting guide routing. This will give you getting started, basic routing. I think we covered pretty much everything in here. Put and delete we didn't really cover. It's the same idea. It's just if you make a put request or a delete request, it's going to run this handler function instead. But we kind of covered the idea. We covered multiple. We did .get and .post. Same thing. .put and .delete works the same way. If you were to go to guide routing, this will give you a more in-depth, which we did cover a good amount of this, not all of it. yeah, you could use .all also instead of .get and .post, and that should be all HTTP requests, regardless of if it's get, post, put, or delete. We didn't cover .next. That's more for middleware type stuff, or if you're doing .all, I suppose. I've never actually used .all. It seems kind of weird to do that, but if you needed to use that. But yeah, there's great docs here. There's some other things, some special type of routing stuff you can do, like plus will match ABCD or ABBCD or ABBBCD, whatever. If you have some, I've never had to use these really. That's some kind of odd cases, but it's there if you needed to use that for some specific case. So yeah, check out these docs for some additional information about routing. I would give it a read. Other than that, I think that's going to bring us to an end for our routing part here. Hopefully that wasn't too long. I tried to cover a lot of stuff here, such as query params, body parser. You can also, if you were going to send JSON, this is if you're going to be sending JSON, another one you would use is body.json, and that's so you can send JSON to your backend, or I guess to your front end, doesn't really matter. There's just another piece of middleware that's a part of body parser here. So yeah, that's another one. We didn't need to use that in our case, but that should be, I think I covered everything I wanted to cover in this topic on routing. And our next video will likely, part 3, will likely be on templating engines. And probably we'll be using handlebars. That's just what I use. I really like the whole handlebar type syntax, but we'll get into that in the next video. So hopefully you guys continue watching, and I'll see you in part 3.